Well, with a gospel like that, I thought I could begin talking about taxation. However, we're still in coalition talks, so it's not safe to do so yet. So what am I going to talk about? Rugby. Now, commiserations, I know that within the congregation this morning there are some that were celebrating at 2 minutes past 10, there's some that were feeling very sad. But we know that many in Aotearoa, New Zealand and other rugby-obsessed countries treat top sports as quasi-religion. We know that here rugby players are treated as gods with a small g. They are feted when they win and they are cut down when they lose. We also know that the rates of domestic violence increase when the All Blacks lose, especially a big game such as semi-finals or finals of the Rugby World Cup. This week there was an opinion piece on the Radio New Zealand website. A social media journalist at Radio New Zealand is in France covering the World Cup rugby. Her name's Yoge Butt, and she stated that she feels like the 2023 Rugby World Cup exists in an alternate reality. She writes, the semi-finals and finals are being held against a backdrop of rising global tensions. Yes, fans have held a minute's silence in solidarity with all those affected by the tragic events in Israel and Gaza. However, she says right now she's struggling to find the hype. As we heard that reading from Matthew's Gospel, I couldn't help but think about the alternative gods in our world. Sports of various codes, social media, influencers, musicians, actors, people held up who are perceived to have power and money and influence. Some people are treated as more special than others. And yet, as it says in our gospel, God treats people with impartiality. And yet the media and society certainly do not. So when the Pharisees and the Herodians posed the question to Jesus about the paying of taxes, they were trying to trap him. And he was not going to fall for it. That much quoted, which was our sentence for today, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's, stopped their line of questioning. Now, Jesus was not justifying a separation of the affairs of religion and the affairs of commerce and government, although over the centuries many have used this passage to argue against the church being political, especially when it comes to advocating for the vulnerable. All of the world is in the midst of jockeying for power, supremacy, accessing and exploiting resources, in a sense trying to make gods out of money. And whether it is extreme violence or sport fanaticism, we're being challenged to ask the question, what is important? What really matters? When we see those horrific images of airstrikes on a civilian hospital, the loss of many innocent lives and those caring for them, the difficult question also needs to be asked, what can we do? How can we prevent further destruction and deaths? Change will only occur when we change, when our heart, our minds, and in turn our systems and social contracts begin to look less like an empire and more like communities that protect the most vulnerable, that care for our fragile ecosystem. There are two currencies that Jesus challenges those around him, and indeed us, to examine. Our commitment to earthly life and our commitment to God's life. And Jesus' response to the Pharisees and the Herodians' question has in turn left us with a question of conscience. What are we to do when our allegiance to authority is in conflict with our allegiance to Christ? And we know that in our world there are devout Christians who hold metrically opposing positions on so many views. As recent political rallies have shown, it can be difficult to align to many who are speaking out in the name or acting in the name of Christ. Just as Palestinians and Israelis do not agree with the actions of some of the more radical factions who are ultimately doing what they believe is right to bring hope and change, but at a huge human cost. It's difficult. It's complicated, but we must engage in the discussion and ask, how can we help? Our donation, perhaps, towards humanitarian aid. But whatever we do, we cannot throw up our hands and say it's too hard and ignore it. Psalm 96, sung so beautifully by the voices this morning, proclaims the total authority of God over all creation and all peoples, including all who have power. God's Son walked into the world of ordinary people, living ordinary lives and advocating for the most vulnerable. So too we are encouraged to give in time, in energy, in resources to do the same. Not to covet a powerful way of life, not to long for more money or influence. There's such a difference between the power and authority of God and the power and authority of human leaders. Our gospel today reminds us that Christ is beyond our systems. The church has controlled who belongs in it and who can speak in it, while many have been waiting at the edges. And this brings me back to rugby. On Thursday, I went to a lecture by Australian feminist theologian Janice McRandall, and the title of her lecture was Theology and Scrummage. It was Theology of Women's Rugby. Organised sport often does not include the same emphasis on women's participation, let alone opportunities for professional players and teams. And even after the recent World Cup women's football, there is no doubt that the benefits will trickle down to grassroots levels, to the development of girls' and women's teams. To put it bluntly, there is not the same dollar value in women's sport. Christian historian Diana Butler-Bass writes, people in sport are becoming economically powerful because of their huge salaries or the way they can turn games into wealth. When you get into the concept of having power over others, you are not in sports anymore. You are not playing games. You are involved in oppression. You are involved in dehumanisation. And Janice McRandall stated that women's rugby has failed as a profit-driven enterprise. However, the game is evolving and developing because normative images around player stereotypes and the type of women who play are being disrupted and must continue to be disrupted. That body must be disrupted so that marginalised bodies fit in, both in sports and in church. Our attitudes, our actions, the way we choose to interact with the divine ties or binds us to God and to one another in faith, in hope, and in love. The worship of false gods, of giving power and authority to those things that can be idolatry, draw us away from the one true God. And in the words of Psalm 96, verse 5 from the Message translation, pagan gods are mere tatters and rags. God made the heavens. And so I conclude the sermon by repeating the words of our collect. Generous God, you know each of us by name, and you show no partiality. Each of us is equally special to you. May we become imitators of Christ, demonstrator of your prodigal hospitality, that we may be known by the quality of our welcome. May we also be known for our commitment to the well-being of our country and our world. Amen.